Did you know that the very life of Jesus reveals to us the character of God? It's true. Famously, John's Gospel opens with a prologue in which he introduces Jesus as the divine Word of God, through whom the world was made. This Word of God, John tells us, is also the light of the world. That is, the one who gives us illumination, knowledge, insight into God's ways and purposes for us. The purpose of John's prologue is to introduce us to the Gospel and to give us the perspective that John wants us to have as the story of Jesus unfolds in the narrative. It's like a lens or a pair of glasses that allows us to see Jesus in the stories that follow the way God Himself sees Him, and not simply as a man from Nazareth. That's important to keep in mind. As we read John's account of the many events and confrontations and teachings of Jesus, we need to maintain the perspective of the prologue, namely that this man who teaches, heals, suffers persecution, and even gives his life to save others, is also the one through whom all things were made, and the one by whom God brings the fullness of divine knowledge to the world. Now, it's very interesting to note that the climax of the prologue of John, in verses 14 to 18, forms a striking allusion to the great theophany that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai in Exodus 34. That was the episode with the golden calf. Do you remember that story? Moses was atop Mount Sinai receiving the law from God, and the people were down below at the foot of the mountain, fashioning a golden calf in direct violation of God's law. It's a very interesting story in all kinds of ways, but the end result was a crisis of God's presence. God told Moses he would depart from the people and not accompany them to the promised land, lest he destroy them on the way. But Moses pleaded with God to restore his presence with the people, for that was the very thing that made this people special and distinct from all other nations. When God finally consented and promised to restore the blessing of his presence to his people as they went into the promised land, Moses sought assurance from God and asked to see the glory of God. Now, this is a magnificent passage and immensely important for our understanding of Israel's relationship with God. But for our purposes, the crux of the account comes in Exodus 34, verses 1 to 8, when the Lord puts Moses in the cleft of the rock and makes his glory pass by Moses. And the Lord declared his name, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. There's more to that passage as the scene continues, but this is the context of John's allusion at the climax of his prologue. John expressly evokes the background of Sinai at John 1:17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. The references to Jesus tabernacling among us and to the fullness of grace and truth in 1:14 cement the allusion and make it clear that John reminds us of this background in order to communicate that in Jesus we have a new and indeed a greater revelation of who God is, a kind of new theophany in which God declares to the world His name, which is His essential identity. Now, I want to draw your attention to one last detail. Notice in verse 16 how he says that out of the fullness of this revelation we have all received grace instead of grace. It's a peculiar expression in the original Greek, but the point is that the revelation God makes about his identity in Jesus takes the place of the earlier theophany at Sinai. The earlier revelation was partial and provisional. This new revelation makes a full and final revelation of God for the world. Consider this. At Sinai, God's glory was revealed merely by word, in a veiled way, and only to one man. In Jesus, God's glory is revealed by flesh given over to death, in an unmitigated way, before all flesh, as Isaiah tells us. In a nutshell, John tells the story of God's glory revealed by Jesus taking on flesh in order to give it over to death so that the world might have life. In Jesus, the love of God is revealed for all the world to see. Why don't you stop the video for a few moments and reflect on that thought? It's remarkable. and it stands at the center of all that John aims to do in his Gospel. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into one of our courses at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about the programs of study that we offer, please contact our admissions department by clicking the link below.